Sometimes people wait their entire lives to see the Northern Lights, but we got lucky on our very first try. So we're here at Jokulsarlon. It's a very famous location in southern Iceland. So looking at the weather today, we have an incredible aurora forecast all the way up to a 4. So we thought this location at the Glacier Bay would be a perfect place to capture it. Now the aurora borealis is also called the Northern Lights, and those are those beautiful green lines of color that you see in a lot of night sky photos. Now with a forecast all the way to a 4, we should be able to see the Northern Lights with our naked eyes. We should be able to see what we want to compose before we photograph it. With lighter aurora activity, sometimes you can't really see it until you take a long exposure. So an exposure of 30 seconds with your camera with light aurora activity will reveal some of that beautiful green light. In this case, we're hoping that with the activity as a 4, we'll be able to see it so clearly that we'll get great photos. Now, seeing the Northern Lights is something that's on so many people's bucket list, and it's also an event that's very, very rare. So not only does there have to be incredible solar activity for this to happen, you also have to be in an area where the sky's clear and everything's ready for you to be able to see it. Now, I've been visiting Iceland for years now, and I've only gotten to see the aurora a few select times. That's because sometimes when there's been aurora activity, the sky's been like this. But tonight, we have a really good chance because the forecast is going to clear up around 10 o'clock, which is actually a really, really good time to view the aurora because the sky is perfectly black. When photographing the aurora, it's best to work around the new moon if possible. We've been checking the moon forecast too and the track of it, and it's a little above half. Now, thankfully, the moon's actually going to be rising in this direction. So when I'm standing this way to photograph the ice with hopefully the nice green lines behind it, the moon's going to be rising and off to the left. Now obviously with no moon in the sky, there would be no light pollution to cause the aurora to be washed out. But since we have the moon and it's actually in a good position, it might give us the opportunity to have that extra highlight on that landscape and give our images a really nice quality. So for this aurora shot, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I've been using the Nikon D810 in a really beefy tripod this whole time. This time I'm going to be using the Fujifilm X-T1 and a smaller lightweight travel tripod. Now usually for night sky photography, we want to use a lens that has an aperture rating of f2.8 because we want to be able to open that aperture all the way up to be able to capture as much light as possible with the night sky. Since there's going to be a moon, I know that I'm not going to have to use the typical night sky settings. I have a feeling that instead of using f2.8 and ISO 1600 to be able to capture this, since we have a lot of adequate moonlight, I have a feeling that we can use an f4 like this lens and maybe not even use ISO 1600 or 3200, maybe 400 or 600. Now, aurora is really interesting because it moves at different speeds. If it's stationary in the sky and really light, we can get away with 30-second exposures, 20-second exposures, and still maintain the clarity of detail. If this aurora is as good as I expect it to be, we can have what's called ribbons. And these ribbons tend to dance in the sky and require shorter exposures than the typical 30. So what I'm hoping is we get a chance to do maybe 5-second or 10-second, 12 to 15-second exposures to try to freeze the aurora in time. Now our video cameras, the ones that we're using, are not really suited to capture low light video, especially with something like the aurora going on behind us. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to set our cameras up to do time lapses in different positions to capture the motion of the aurora so we can show you how it moves over time. One interesting thing about this environment is I consider it to be very dynamic. The dynamic elements being these icebergs. They're going to move and change position over time. So if I'm doing timed exposures of 30 seconds, there's a chance that they're going to move and cause some blur. So I'm going to have to find a good balance between capturing the night sky at a certain exposure and also compensating for the movement of the ice. Now that varies, depends on how they're crashing into each other. So if I time my shots, there's some moments where they're actually static and other moments when they're actually moving. So I'm just going to have to mess around a little bit at night to find that perfect balance and exposure. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my camera to its lowest aperture. In this case, this lens supports f4. Once it's at f4, I'm going to find a good exposure time, and I'm going to adjust that exposure time by changing the ISO. So for example, if I use an ISO of 200 with a 30-second exposure, I can get a 15-second exposure with ISO 400. I can get an 8-second exposure with ISO 800 and a 4-second exposure with ISO 1600. Now bear in mind, the more I increase the ISO, the more grain will end up in the resulting image. Now sometimes if the aurora is moving really fast or my objects are moving really fast in the foreground, it's going to be important that I freeze those in time. So I might have to use a higher ISO than I maybe want to. That's okay though, because we can always mitigate some of that noise by adjusting it in post-processing. So I've spent a little bit of time scoping out this scene, and I think I'm going to go for this shot first. I'm not really sure where the aurora is going to pop up, but I'm hoping it's going to be behind that mountain. Once I get a shot that I like here, I think I'm also going to move off to my left. There's this little mound right here that gives me a beautiful view of the mountain and the shoreline. So really tonight, the best case scenario is for me to get 2 or 3 different shots and different angles that I like. One of the reasons that we decided to visit Iceland in the wintertime was a chance to have this kind of aurora activity. Now, it's never a guarantee, but in this case, we're hoping to get really, really lucky. So now that we've scoped everything out, it's just a waiting game. We're gonna head back to our hotel, get a hot meal, some coffee, and we're gonna continue to watch the weather and watch the skies and hope for a chance that the aurora comes out. So we're back out here at Jokulsarlon. We have some good snow. It's been snowing for a little while. We're just starting to see the aurora in the clear patch in the sky. It looks like the clouds are moving over us, so I'm pretty confident that that clear spot's gonna kind of open up a window around us. And if that window does open up, then we are gonna start seeing some nice aurora activity in the shot that we've already scouted here. So the hope is that this snow leaves some nice white on the ground, the sky opens up, and if it does, I think we're gonna have really nice images to work with. So I've been shooting a few test frames here, and it looks like because of the moonlight, I can have a lower ISO than I expected. So I usually start this with my lowest f-stop. In this case, with this lens, the 10-24 on the Fujifilm, it's an f4 lens. So I have it set to f4. I start with 30 seconds, and the first thing that I did was 800 ISO, but it came out way, way too bright. So with the moonlight, I actually found out that I can shoot a low 200 to 250 ISO with 30 seconds, which is really, really nice for the night sky because that's an ultra low grain image. So since the aurora was moving around a little bit, I decided that I could go down to 10 or 15 seconds and just bump that ISO up instead. So after looking at that, I decided that I liked the 15-second version better than the 30-second version because it had more detail in the aurora. So take a look at these two photos. The first one has a 30-second exposure and the second one is a 15. In the 30-second exposure, you can see that the ice is moving a little bit and the aurora looks kind of washy. But if we take a look at the 15-second exposure, the aurora looks a little bit more crisp, we see a little bit more of the details, and we have less movement in the foreground. So I'm really liking the shots I'm getting down here with the ice in the foreground. Now I'm gonna hike up to the top of the hill, and with this nice white on the ground, I'm gonna see what compositions I can find that are different. So I've climbed to the top of this hill over here, and it's interesting when I'm composing these shots because I can kind of see the landscape back there because of the moonlight, but I actually can't see anything in the back of my camera. So I'm using the in-camera level system so that I know that this is actually level. And this is really nice because it has a feature. It's a mirrorless camera with a feature called focus peaking, which allows me to set the focus here in this digital dial. So I know with the aurora stuff, with this kind of landscape, that I'm gonna go ahead and set it to infinite. That tells me that without a doubt, my infinite point is gonna be in focus. So I've set up this shot. It's really cool. I can't really see what's back there, but take a look at this file. I really like the way it looks. I like the snowy landscape in the foreground. I kind of like how the mountain is centered. And unlike the other shot over the ice, where the aurora is going right above the ice and kind of coming right down into the center of the frame, this one's really cool because it's crossing the top of the frame. So I think I'd planned to shoot the ice in Jokulsarlon and that be the shot that I wanted, but I think I like the second alternate shot better. So even with this mixed snowy weather, we've had some really incredible aurora. It's had these really nice long lines that have stretched all the way across the sky. And at times it was really, really slow. And a few times, some of the bands that came through were really, really fast. So throughout all of the aurora activity, I kind of played with different shutter speeds because I know in post, I can look at all those photos and figure out which one worked the best. So what I'm going to do is take my favorite shot from each angle and we're going to bring them into Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop and we're going to complete the images. Welcome back to the studio, everybody. This is lesson 15. We're back in Iceland and we're taking a look at how to edit Northern Lights photos. If you took a look at the video from Iceland, you remember that it was very hard to film because it was pitch black, and obviously it has to be pitch black to be able to see the Northern Lights. We didn't have a new moon, we actually had a partial moon, so while that did drown out some of the Northern Light activity, it also illuminated the landscape. So if you don't have a moon in the sky, the only light that you get is from the Northern Lights, so your landscape ends up being a little bit green. This was actually really nice because the moon complemented the landscape, and since it was all icy, it was nice, clean light. So we have some really nice images to work with. Now, of course, you never know when there is going to be Northern Light activity, but we were really lucky while we were in Iceland with a dark sky and really nice Northern Light activity. So let's take a look at how to edit these files. Take a look inside of Capture One here. Out of about an hour and a half of Northern Light activity, it peaked for about 20 minutes. And during those 20 minutes, I got two shots that I really liked. This one of Jokulsarlon Glacier Lagoon, which is really beautiful. This was a little bit difficult because the moon was actually off to the left, so it illuminated the landscape, but these icebergs started to move really fast. So earlier in the shooting, I actually got them nice and static and still, but later on they started to move. So this is a really nice balance of light activity in the sky, a little bit of reflection in the lagoon. I also got this shot here, which is just slightly to the right. You can see the lagoon on the left here. It's a really nice icy landscape. You actually see a guy with a headlamp all the way in the back, and you can see these bands of the Northern Lights just wrapping all the way into the distance. This is a really beautiful location to shoot. So we're going to start with this image first. Now, this is a little bit different than everything else that we've shot. This is a nighttime shot, and it's the first time that we've really dealt with just a 100% nighttime location. Since there was a moon, there was a small benefit of being able to shoot at a lower ISO than usual. So with a lower ISO, I actually have less noise in the sky, so there's going to be less noise to get rid of. If you shoot the Northern Lights and you have an ISO of 1600 or 3200, it tends to be a little bit grainy, but since I think this was shot around 200 to 400 throughout the night, I actually ended up with a very, very clean image. So the first thing in Capture One is something that I want to address. This was shot at f2.8, which means that there's a lot of vignetting. So inside of the options here, right here, we can find where we can correct the distortion, and that's already been corrected at 100%, but we also have to change the light fall off. By changing the light fall off, you can see that I'll correct that dark vignetting that happens at f2.8. Throughout this tutorial, we've been shooting a lot at f8 and f11, so we really haven't had to worry about this too much since it's that sweet spot on the lens. But for these files at f2.8, we're really going to have to make sure we get rid of those dark edges. The reason being, it's not that I'm anti-vignette, but when we start adding more contrast to the sky, it's going to pull and make that vignette even more intense. So with the vignette corrected, we'll go back to the color correction. Let's talk about this scene. The Northern Lights, in shooting, I mentioned that it's very important to make sure that none of the activity on the Northern Lights is blown out. So I was very careful with the histogram here. I was very careful with my exposure. Since I have a lot of white objects and a lot of light in the sky, I was very careful to keep it as underexposed as possible, while still maintaining some of the clarity in the sky. So what I really want to do here is bring out the shadows a little bit and compensate by adding a little bit of contrast. So if I increase the shadows here, I can actually pull the exposure back down so that I can get a darker, more contrasty scene. So this starts to look pretty nice. The other thing that I can do once I balance this is I can add clarity. So remember, back in Lightroom we don't use clarity, but clarity inside of Capture One is much cleaner, and it adds some nice drama and pop to the image before we even go into Photoshop. So right off the bat, we can get something a little bit better. And what I'm just trying to do is balance this. And by balancing it, I'm changing the contrast. And while I've changed the contrast, I've also noticed that there's a little bit of problem with the color. I think that the tint was a little bit off in the camera. So let's address that as well. Here in the colors palette, you can see that we have, I was shooting at a custom white balance, which I usually do. So the Kelvin looks pretty good, but the tint might be a little bit off. You can see if I move it to the right, it's going to change it. And move it to the left, it's going to make it a little bit more green. I just want to add a little bit more of the magenta back in just to clean up that white. I feel like it was a little bit off. So I'm going to make some minor adjustments here. And don't feel like you need to get this completely right because we can always change it later in Photoshop. I just want those whites to be a little bit crisper, and I don't want any green in there at all. And we will pick up a little bit of green here, but for the most part the moonlight was making it nice and white. So with that all in mind, that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to drop the shadows a little bit looking at this, make it nice and contrasty, and I'm also going to pull the values up a little bit. So I'm going to compress them down, just like that. Pull the shadows and compress. That looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and get this inside of Photoshop. Same as usual, export variants. Throughout this tutorial, you've seen me work at 8 and 16-bit. With this type of file, even though it's going to take longer to load everything, I'm going to keep it at 16-bit. Chances are I'm going to push the colors a little further than usual. I'm going to take this file, and I'm actually going to bring it into a PSD I already created. I already brought in the before image, so that's straight out of camera with no adjustments. This is my adjusted image that we just brought in. First thing that I'm going to do is add the contrast back in by going to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro. So let's see if we can get some of that contrast back. I'll maximize this screen for us. Obviously, dynamic contrast is going to play a nice role in making all of this pop. And you can see it's adding little detail in the sky, which is really nice. Correct contrast is probably going to pull the whites up, which we can do a little bit. We have to be very careful not to overexpose these areas. Very sensitive highlights to work with. Correcting the color cast will probably add, let's see, it's mitigating some of the color there, but it's not really making too much of a difference. I'm going to leave it alone. So I'm just going to focus on how much contrast I want in the image. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to disrupt the sky. I want it to be soft, but I still want all this little detail. But I really like what the dynamic contrast is doing to the water. See how it's picking up all those nice highlights? If I slide this over too much, though, you can see that while it's adding a very positive effect to the water, it's not really adding much more of a positive effect to the sky. So what I want to do is leave this as is, add a second Pro Contrast filter, change the dynamic contrast for the water, and just add it here using a U pointer to. I'm just going to go ahead and select it so it just manipulates the water, the reflection. So the nice thing is this is just sort of increasing the detail of the reflection and adding sort of a nice balance to the composition. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and add one more filter. I want to add a brilliance and a warmth. There's one slider here that I want to talk about. It's perceptual saturation. So if I just saturate this here, you can see that it's evenly going to distribute the saturation, just like a regular saturation slider would do in Photoshop. But the perceptual one analyzes the pixels around it and tries to find other levels of saturation. Turning it all the way up to ridiculous shows all these purples, blues, and light colors that were in the sky, and all the little ice chunks too. So by adding a little bit of this, just a tiny little bit, maybe 6%, we can actually bring some of those values back into the sky. So lightly bring some of those purples back. We don't really need it in the foreground, so I'm just going to concentrate on having it right in the sky where I want it, where I want those blues and purples to be separated. I'll expand the control points, turn the masking mode on, and I'll just make sure that I get rid of it here in the water and on the icebergs. I just want it in the sky. That looks pretty good. So we'll turn this off. Not bad at all. I'll go ahead and apply this effect. Let's view the results. So we have from Capture One, we have Pro Contrast. I feel like I went a little bit overboard with it, so I'm going to roll it back to about 80% instead of 100%. I'm going to duplicate this layer here, and I'm going to merge it down so it's 80% of what I actually achieved there, and it's a little bit softer. Now what I want to do is I want to address more contrast in the sky. So my sharpest highlight here in the aurora is this green area, but I want to pull out more details towards the top. So what I'm going to do is create a curves layer, and I'm going to create contrast in these curves. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw a gradient ramp. What I want to happen here is I want the curves to only affect the sky and not affect the iceberg. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw a gradient ramp from 100% to 0% here. And now when I adjust the curves, you can see that I'm only going to be affecting the sky. So I can bring those values of the sky up a little bit and maintain the values here in the bottom. And what I also want to do is pull the darker values down so that I can add more contrast. So it's a little bit different than using a brightness and contrast because it gives us control over where we can leave the shadows and how we can increase the highlights and create our own custom contrast. So this is a very powerful way to work. The next thing that I want to do is go ahead and address some of the sharpness. Now, with this kind of editing with the Northern Lights, you don't want to push it too far. You just want it to have more details than it had straight out of camera. So as you can see, straight out of camera, it was really beautiful, but it was still a little flat. Needs some encouragement in the highlights, needs some encouragement in the shadows, and some texture and detail in the sky as well. So as we start to edit, we can start to slowly bring that back and put the attention back on these beautiful bands and curtains of Aurora Borealis. So right now, since I've went ahead and done the contrast here in the sky, what I'm going to do is also sharpen the foreground layer. So we're going to start by using a high pass filter. We'll filter, other, high pass. Well, it's fun how these tools become recurring themes in our landscape photography, but it's because they're the most useful tools we have. So again, here we have, if I zoom in, really sharp ice. It was nice and still for me, and with the high pass filter you can see it chisels out all that detail. We have to be careful though, as it will also chisel out the star detail, but it will add more noise to the sky. So we'll create a gradient ramp on a mask here and do the same thing that we did before. It's just this time we'll have it fade out till it hits the sky. So now our sharpening only hits these icebergs, and we'll take it one step further by loading the brush tool and our quick mask mode, and I'll go ahead and paint out the water. So I don't want any of the water to be sharp. I want that to be nice and soft, and I want the edges of my ice to be razor sharp. That's pretty nice. Spent a lot of time trying to get the right position so that these weren't blurry, so now I want to make sure that they stay sharp and the water stays really nice and soft. So there we go. That looks pretty good. We have some sharpening done. We have some basic contrast. And the next thing I want to show you is how to get more detail out of the aurora. So right now I've done the contrast, but what I want to do is get the details to pop a little bit. So I'm going to use one more effect from Nik Collection, and that's going to be under Color Effects Pro. We're going to use the detail extractor. Be careful when you're using the detail extractor, because as you can see, by default, it makes it look like a bad HDR image. So don't do that. The best thing to do initially is to turn this percentage down. And with this, I like subtlety. I just want a little bit of details. And sometimes I even turn the saturation off. But right now, 5 or 6 of these values, believe it or not, somewhere around 5 to 8, or an extreme case would be 10, even down to 2 at a minimum, will still give you a little bit of pop and a little bit of detail here. So if I start to change the contrast, you can see the contrast around those edges pulls up. That was a little bit too much. If I start to change the details, you can see that's going to pull those details. That's going to give you the negative HDR look. So you want to be very, very soft-handed on these. Something like I said, 4 to 5 to 6 is probably plenty. And this is just going to be a small effect for the sky. And what I want to do is say OK, and I'm going to apply that. Remember that I only want these details in the sky. I do not really want them in the foreground here. And you can see as I toggle this on and off, I'm getting some positive effects with the ice, but I feel like it's too distracting. And the sky's pretty nice. So the first thing I want to do is set the opacity of this effect. So I might have gone a little bit overboard, but I think 60 to 75% was pretty nice. That looks good. That's a positive change to the sky. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is duplicate the layer underneath and flatten this out so that I have a clean layer. The reason is all of this drama that I've added to the sky has also increased the noise overall. So I'm going to have to really be aggressive in fixing that. And since I created this new detail extractor layer on top and it had opacity, in order to apply a global define effect, it needs to have an opacity of 100%. So I've applied the amount of texture I wanted to add to the sky so that I can go back into the filter and add my softening. Remember, we use define for noise reduction. The basic analysis actually looks pretty good. I don't even know if I need to do a manual one, but we'll go ahead and try. Sometimes just the default settings do a pretty good job. You can also see that it maintains these stars. I did 30 seconds. You can see I have a little bit of a streak. It gets rid of all that artifacting, but it actually leaves these stars. But let's see what happens if we do a manual selection around this same area. Let's see if it gets more intense with the reduction. Click on Measure Noise. And as it works, a little bit more intense, pretty much the same. And that's a big difference. That's like night and day. Say OK and apply the noise reduction. Very nice. As you can see here before, very noisy. We've lost some of the stars, but that's OK. The focus is on the aurora. We've added some detail. We've removed a little bit of the detail with the softening, but overall it looks pretty good. Nice soft sky. So we don't want that softness here in the ice because we've been very careful to keep that ice very sharp. So I'm going to go ahead and mask this out just like this so that this stays soft all the way to the edge of this cloud, right about there. Perfect. So that's the define, the softening. We have a nice soft sky, we have a sharp foreground, and we have a nice soft reflection. Overall, this looks pretty good. One last thing to note though, I've added all this nice softness to the sky. I'm going to go ahead and brush it into the water as well so that I get rid of any potential noise that happens to be in the water. So very similar to what I removed with the high pass filter, I'm now adding in to the softening layer. Very, very easy. I'll also add a little bit more to the base of the sky. Just brush it in a little bit manually. This isn't the mountain that I'm brushing in here. This is actually a cloud on top of the mountain, so that can be soft as well. I don't want any noise in that cloud. And that looks great. This is actually a really nice Northern Light shot, and very lucky for Lee and Patrick's first trip ever to Iceland. So if you take a look at this, we have, let's see, we have a before straight out of camera, and then we have an after, an edited file. Well, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and save this now, just in case. And we're going to go back into Capture One, and we're going to take a look at the second file. So I wanted to give you guys two files to mess with here, really because they're very different, actually. One is a glacier lagoon, which is constantly changing and always evolving or moving. I had some issues with the ice. Some of it was really sharp, some of it was moving really fast. So I had streaky ice, sharp ice, all sorts of stuff like that. This was my favorite shot. But when I turned the camera around, I ended up with something pretty cool as well. So this is up on top of the hill at Jokulsarlon, looking down, and with the snow-covered landscape, it actually created something I'd never seen before. I'd never seen this area covered in snow, so it was a really fun area to be able to capture the Northern Lights. And as you can see, the direction changed. So the one shot that we were looking at here, you can see that the lights are directly overhead. The bands were going right over our head. But as we turned the camera, we could see the bands moving over the side. So the bands were going across the frame. In this case, created a really nice composition of the lines of the lake and the lines of the aurora kind of working together and leading the eye through the frame. So this edit's going to be largely similar to what we just did, but I wanted to give you guys two files to mess with. The aurora is sometimes a once-in-a-lifetime activity, so I wanted to give you guys two files to mess with so you'll know exactly what to do when you're in Iceland or Norway and you're trying to capture the aurora for yourself. Let's take a look at this file. Same thing. First, we have to go in and mess with the vignetting. So we'll change the light fall off. Don't feel like you have to leave it at 100% with Capture One. You can go a little bit further if you want until you feel that you've gotten rid of all of the vignetting. Again, this is f2.8, ISO 320, so there's going to be a lot of vignetting at 14 millimeters, so we might have to go just past that 100% mark. With that in mind, the white balance looks pretty good. I was able to do that in camera, that's not bad. But this highlight here is a little troublesome. It's funny because you can actually see this tiny little green spike. That's that little bit right there. So it can be very problematic. Well, one thing that'll ruin your Northern Light shots, if you're not careful, is blowing out the Northern Lights. Don't ever do that. You want it to be nice and consistently green. It can be hot in certain areas, but not blown out. So this looks good, but I wouldn't want it to be too much brighter. So what I'm going to do is, same thing that I did before, I'm going to pull the exposure down overall, and I'm going to increase the shadows around it. Well, it's funny with this, if I change the highlight slider, you see that nothing really happens because there are no highlights. That's the only area that I really have of highlights. So it's not anything that I need to use right now. We'll have to address any issues in post in Photoshop if this becomes a problem. After that, I'm going to add a little bit more clarity in. Clarity works really good in Capture One. Try not to roll too much past 20. Somewhere between 15 and 20 should be good. Gives you a nice, just instant pop before you start using any of the plugins inside of Photoshop. Looks pretty good. Let's get this into Photoshop. Export. We'll say variance. And we'll keep it at 16-bit. So here we go. That looks pretty good. Again, we're just going to do some light things. This is going to be the same exact workflow that we did before under Knit Collection, Color Effects Pro. Maybe a little bit different because the landscape's different. We might not push it quite as far. The last file I was looking at, the Northern Lights were really soft. This file, the Northern Lights are pretty intense. So this is our adjusted from Capture One. It's going to be about the same workflow, but we'll go ahead and run through it together anyway. Color Effects Pro. Starting with Pro Contrast, or Dynamic Contrast that we've gotten so accustomed to using. You can see that just pulls those edges out, makes it really nice. If I start to correct the contrast, check this out. It starts to look good. It's really making it bright, it's making it dynamic, but look what happens. I'm starting to get this problem in this highlight. So to mitigate that, what I can do is just roll the highlights back here on this slider, and you can see that that's just going to fix that problem right there. So just roll it back just a little bit, enough to make sure that we're not blowing out this area of highlights. So we make sure that we're careful to protect it. So I'll make some minor adjustments here. Again, we'll see what the correct color cast wants to do. It wants to add magenta. In this case, it's pretty much a white landscape, so we have to be really careful because any type of color shift will show up right on that white. That looks pretty good. In this case, I'm just going to leave this one very basic. This is already really intense. We don't have to push this aurora very far at all. In fact, I might pull it back just even a little bit more and say okay. Let's look at the result together. That, again, sometimes when you're in the other window, it looks really good, but I'm going to roll it back to about 80%. of what I thought would be right. And that looks pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and bake this one down again just by merging these layers like I usually do, so we have a clean result at 80%. Now here's where it gets kind of fun. Let's go back into Nik Collection. We'll go back up to Color Effects Pro, and I'm gonna add some more detail using the detail extractor, but this time I'm gonna be subtle on the result and I'm gonna paint in the difference. So again, detail extractor, turn it down from its ridiculous base settings into something a little bit more manageable, somewhere between 4 and 6. And in this case, I'll go up a little bit higher than I usually do, and I'll apply the result. Pay attention to the before and after here. What I really want to point out is these are basically called, I call them tendrils or curtains. A curtain is actually what's happening here, these little bits that fall off these bands or these tendrils. But with the detail extractor, you can see that it pops some of those details out. I don't really like what it's doing to the sky here, but I like some of this detail. So what I'm going to do is custom paint this in. I'm going to black out a mask by holding Option, clicking the new mask button, select the brush tool, and I'm going to select a very light flow, and what I'm going to do is just start painting some of these details back in where I want them. I just want to be able to custom lead the eye through this. So think of these northern lights as natural leading lines, and really I'm just trying to bring out some of the details in some of the areas. That's it, just a little tiny bit in those little areas makes a big difference. And something that I like to do with my northern light shots is always add a little bit of extra detail, which I feel adds more intrigue to the sky and makes it a little bit more unique. It also makes it stand out from the rest. And that's all I really want to do with those details, just a little bit. Seems subtle, but for me, it's just enough. So I'll go ahead and flatten that result again so that we can do our noise reduction. But before that, we'll go ahead and take care of the sharpening. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer, create another high pass filter. And we'll just address the landscape real quick. Again, even my composition is so close to the same that my mask is probably going to be about the same too. So using the gradient tool, I really just want a sharp foreground and a soft background. And that looks pretty good. The next step is to either adjust any luminosity issues or just go ahead and take care of the noise reduction. Again, since we've added a little bit of detail in the sky, we've also added some extra noise. This one was shot at ISO 320, which in the scheme of things for ISO is not really that high, but it will still have some extra noise. Especially around these edges here and around these stars, you can see that that noise turns into some pretty bad artifacting. So right now, if I shared this on Facebook, and I shared it at a resolution of about 2048 or 1600, chances are nobody would ever see that noise. But if this was going to print, I'd have to take special consideration about making sure that my softening was just as important as my sharpening. And again, it helps lead the eye through the frame, but you don't want people to see negative aspects of noise and artifacting. So again, Define's great. It's actually one of the best noise reduction plugins available, and it comes with Nik Collection already. So that's obviously a big perk since you already own the suite. Here's the automatic profile. You can see that it's doing an okay job, but I want it to be a little bit more intense. So I'm going to measure this area so it really focuses on that intense noise that we have to mitigate. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. I'll go ahead and apply the result. Just like last time, I'll add a mask, add a gradient, and we'll focus on that softness just being present in the sky so we don't lose any of the details. At this point, it's just some basic cleanup. This is interesting too. I've done a really good job of removing people in the past, but you can see I have a few people back there. I'm going to leave them there. They were actually a really nice couple that I was talking to, and you can see this guy's painting the landscape with a headlamp. So in this case, I'm going to leave the people instead of getting rid of them because I don't think they're that noticeable, and I actually kind of like that tiny little light back there. Last thing I'm going to do is just adjust everything with curves. If I load up my curves, you can see that I still have some highlights missing in my curves. So if I crank these curves up a little bit, you can see I start to get the overall brightness of the entire scene. But see what happens here. If I start to pull the curves up too much, I'm going to start to overexpose. See that one hotspot, that one problematic hotspot. So here's something that I can do. Instead of just doing a global curves or doing a gradient curves, I'm going to create a curves based on the luminosity. And this is a really useful trick. So I'm going to go to channels and I'm going to load the luminosity. I'm going to go back to layers and I'm going to go ahead and create the curves again. Now with the curves selected, you can see that I have a luminosity for the highlights. We've done this a few times. I'm going to invert it with a Command I, and now it's going to black out those problematic areas of highlights. So when I apply this tone curve now, it's going to adjust everything around those highlights while protecting them. It's going to take a long time before those highlights become blown out. So it allows me to basically color correct everything around those highlights, but protect them. So I can bring the whole vibrance of the scene up a little bit. This is actually almost like a gamma boost, and I can also protect some of the shadows. So I end up with a nice overall bump in the luminosity overall. And that all looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and bring in the unedited version really quick so we can do a final comparison in the before and after. So I'll go ahead and reset everything that we changed here. I'll reset this, reset everything, and I'll also go back here and I'll pull that fall off down a little bit and export this and bring it back into Photoshop. Select all, copy, and we'll paste it in, put it on the bottom, and we've gone very far. Let's go ahead and look at the before and the after. It's a huge difference. Full of vibrance, color, texture, detail. It's really beautiful. So it's a way to enhance an experience that's already beautiful. We can use the same simple tools that we did in landscape, regular landscape photography, and apply them to nightscape stuff too. But we have to be a little bit careful because there's noise, there's other things to take into consideration, and it's always good to bring in your before so you never lose sight of where you started to where you're going. At any point here, because this has been pretty non-linear, we can go ahead and roll back these effects or go back to any stage of the process if we want to take things back a notch or make any additional edits. So that wraps up the chapter on the Northern Lights. I hope you enjoyed it. We were definitely excited to get Northern Light activity while we were in Iceland. It was something that we really wanted to include in this tutorial, so we were really pleased that we had incredible activity and a really beautiful area to capture.